Good afternoon, Chair, my fellow speakers, and members of the audience. It's a pleasure to be here in Delhi. I keep coming back to Delhi, apparently Delhi organizes all these conferences, like these big conferences to deal with political theory and, social movements. So I just keep coming back to Delhi, every 2 or 3 months. Now my background is in social movements, and basically I look at the sociological perspectives of the new social movements that are emerging in India in the recent times. So what I'll be doing is I'll essentially be talking about, I'll be taking democracy as an enabling condition of imparting social justice, and I'll be at the end of my presentation I'll be trying to sort of, try to find some linkages where transnational solidarities can be found, where using democracy as an idea, whereby, social justice can be meted out among the various emerging democracies. So I'll start by first trying to trace the lineage of democracy as an idea in India, because I have to start with the test case. So now democracy as an idea, we know that it emerged in 19th century Europe, and it had this idea of the individual autonomy, for example, as its cornerstone. Now when it was adopted in India, in a colonial perspective, people like Bipan Chandra Pal and some of our national leaders, they gave a curious turn to the idea of democracy in India. They sort of took the idea of individual autonomy and they transposed it in a case of collective ideal. For example, when Bipan Pal, Bipin Pal, he was writing about the national economy early, around 1905, 1906, when the Swadeshi movement was taking place. He said that not only is it a question of individual priority for us to have an economy of India, which can regenerate India on its own, but it's also a moral imperative for us, because it's also a question of justice for us, because the colonial state has perpetrated injustice on us by stripping away the assets. So in order for us to regenerate, this has to be a collective ideal. So he gave it a curious moral twist. So from there on, right from the time of the Constituent Assembly debates, when they were taking place, it became a sort of, a tool for the idea of democracy. It became a tool for collective bargaining among the various, disenfranchised groups in India. And we saw, the kind of debates that took place regarding the adoption of uniform civil code, regarding the question of religious minorities and other such questions when it came to the idea of social justice in India. What happened, now I take a leap from there and I go to the early 1980s and till the time of, the liberalization of the economy. And I see that, initially, the political economy of India, it was more or less, the state was more or less, it had a sort of welfareist dispensation under Nehru and, the post-Nehruvian ideals. And it sort of tried to intervene very heavily in the economy, and it sort of tried to safeguard and provide certain kind of jobs and other privileges to its citizens. From the mid-1980s, we see that this ruling coalition is actually shrinking. There is, on the one hand, there is a fragmentation of the polity. On the other hand, we see that, the increasingly, with the ruling elite is shrinking, and the business lobbies and other such, organizations, they're playing a very important role in sort of trying to gain the largest share of pie for themselves. And as the time progressed, right now we are seeing a lot of these movements that are taking place, like the POSCO movement and other, movements that are raging, the Maoist movements, for example, who say they are fighting for justice. And they are trying to reclaim the language of democracy for themselves, because they feel that, the Indian state has failed them, in the last 2 decades or so. So basically what they're doing is, they're trying to claim their two phases of this democratic mobilization in order to claim social justice. First one, they're calling it the pragmatic social justice, the kind of fights that were taking place, like through the PILs and other stuff, like through the judiciary. And the other is, like the redemptive phases of collective mobilization that we are seeing, like say the anti-corruption movement or the anti-rape movement that we saw, or like the huge turnout that Delhi saw, like when the Section 377 was upheld by the Supreme Court. What this is doing is this largely is trying to say that like the Indian democracy, it needs to redeem itself, because the constitutional guarantees and other such like checks and balances that were set in place, they have failed the citizens, especially the marginalized groups. So right now there are three sorts of developments. One is the armed struggle that like we are seeing in the Maoist heartlands. Another is the civic discontent, like the anti-corruption movement, the Aam Aadmi Party, and other such things. And another is, like the development of the political society, which falls somewhat between the two, like Partha Chatterjee has eloquently written about this particular idea. And we have seen that, like these sort of social movements, they have sprung up in various countries, like in Tunisia, Egypt, and Occupy movements. So what people are doing is, like in order to claim justice, or like in order to claim what they think is rightfully being denied to them, they're trying to blur the gap between the daily subjectivities. Like you're going out and you're trying to, in India, for example, if you're trying to get a passport, like my father has been trying to get a passport for the last 1.5 years, like 1 year, 8 months, and we still don't know, like if he's at all going to get the passport. And we're absolutely frustrated with the idea. Like we go to the police, they say, like we can't do anything about this. We go to the passport officer, he says, like go to the police. And basically we have no idea when this is going to, and this is not my case only, like this is a case with a lot of people who are trying to get their daily things done, like getting an electricity permit and things like that. So now what they have done is they have come out and they have tried to, like they have joined political parties, and like they have tried to mobilize themselves and to make themselves heard, and like in the broad idea of anti-corruption movement, for example. So what sort of institutional designs like that can emanate from this? There are two views regarding the kind of institutions. One is like if you take the idea of like the Cosmopolitan theory of justice, for example, it says that like there's an instrumental idea of justice, which says that certain democratic or certain rights, like such as right to health, they are important in themselves, and institutions must be so designed that like they uphold these guarantees no matter what. And another is like the democratic view, which says that like the stakeholders, they need to be taken into account, and they need to have a kind of say when it comes to designing these institutions, whether they may be transnational or whether they might be like the local self-government, but the stakeholders, they need to have a say. So this kind of this says that like a person's fundamental rights, they need to be protected, and beyond this, like beyond the protection of these fundamental rights, there needs to be a sort of institutional design which says that which takes everybody as equal, and it sort of gives them a space to deliberate, And it might be that there might be competing ideals of justice, like for example, like my idea of fairness might be different from, like a person who has been a person from scheduled caste, for example. But it says that, like beyond the protection of the fundamental rights of this person, we need to have a platform where people with various conceptions of justice can come together and they can deliberate that what sort of an institution we can take place, And in this idea, from this platform, the global institutions can act as gatekeepers. Like if we take labor laws, for example, there's been a clamor throughout India that, like the labor laws, they need to be relaxed. Hiring and firing, that should be, like more in tune with the kind of things that we see in developed countries, because, like the idea of the vociferous demands of CII, for example, has been that, like firing recalcitrant workers in India is very difficult. Mm. So one of the things that global institutions, like the European Union, for example, it has done, is that it holds, like this, it has certain standards of, labor laws that when they're violated, it's not acceptable to the collective as a whole. So in a way, the global institutions, they can be regional collectives like the, like the South Asian Regional Cooperation Organization and collectives such as that, and they can act as gatekeepers to ensure that, like the certain fundamental rights of the workers, we know that there are fires in factories in Bangladesh, for example, and like every 2 or 3 years or more frequently we hear that, like so many people have died in factory fires. So these institutions can act as gatekeepers beyond these fundamental rights to ensure that, there can be a sort of cosmopolitan idea of justice or a broad generalized idea of justice that can be upheld. So where I'm going from here is I want to say that, I want to first start with the idea of Hobbes, who said that, obviously for justice to be realized, then it needs to be backed by law. In other words, there should be a sovereign, which backs the idea of justice with a threat of using force if somebody, doesn't play by the rules. So there is this central tension, when we examine the idea of cosmopolitan justice in an empirical perspective, that what happens to sovereignty? Like my previous presenter, he was talking briefly about this issue. And there's also another idea that I would like to tease out here, which is the idea of, what happens when we look at the democracy as an idea itself, because intrinsic to the idea of democracy is the idea of citizenship. And there is also this idea that, in this entire body of the cosmopolitan justice itself, that there is this idea that, certain rights, they only apply in case of citizens, for example. Like people like Will Kimlicka and others, who privilege national borders, they have talked about this issue. And what happens, what happens to the people, who are not necessarily belonging to our country or belonging to one particular collective? So this is important because the central paradox of our time, as I see, is the fact that, globalization, it has broadened and, it has spread its arms, and, most of the countries, they have embraced globalization. And it has sort of, open the idea that, the people can move more freely relatively these days. But it has left the coercive powers of the state intact. In a sense that it's still easier for national states to actually violate human rights within their own domains. So it reduces, in a way, it has also reduced avenues for, reducing inequality. So we need to build more. We need to build solidarities. We need to have transnational solidarities. The kind of movements that we have, anti-corporate movements that that have sprung up in various developed regions of the world, and also the kind of movements for democracy that we have seen in Africa in the recent times, and now we see that there is an Aam Aadmi Party in Pakistan as well. So one of the flip sides of globalization has been, just as it has reduced, the certain capacities of the state, it has also made it possible for us to, to remain in an interlinked world and exchange ideas and find our own ways to deal with the current inequities. So how do we ensure universal participation then, if we have to ensure social justice? One of the things that, once again, I'll take the case of the Aam Aadmi Party, for example. Like they have taken the idea of corruption, for example, and they use it as an empty signifier, in the sense that like they didn't try to say that there is an idea of there is a threshold of corruption that like it needs to be above this amount of money in order for that to qualify as corruption. It has sort of tried to say that like everybody, each one of us is affected in one way or the other, and it has said that like look, come and join this platform. You can have issues. I have issues with the platform, for example, but its political strategy has been that like it has tried to sort of create this empty signifier called corruption because it catches the imagination of general Indians. So fundamentally, we see that like what we're trying to do is we have to reimagine democracy as, especially in the context of developing countries, as beyond like formal procedural guarantees, and we have to reimagine it as a language, as a dynamic process, which sort of says that like the existing processes, they have failed. That doesn't mean we need to do away with the Constitution. That does not mean that we need to do away with the principles of checks and balances. But we need to find newer forms of creating solidarity, newer forms of like popular protests or other sorts of like ways of channeling our discontent in order to reimagine and reclaim the democracy for ourselves. And the idea that I'm trying to explore in my larger project is like I'm looking at the idea of populism, and I'm trying to see that like what sort of if I try to bring in the idea of populism as enunciated by Laclau, for example, who says that like we need to come down from the broader part of democracy which says about which only claims about rights, and we need to first start from bottom up, in the sense that we need to bring about, like we need to look into demands. We need to look into the demands and start from there and build from there. In other words, we need to build again our bottoms up kind of a democracy, especially like which is especially relevant in the case of India and other developing countries. So this basically like this what I'm trying to say is, in order for justice to be realized, we need to first see that there is a contingency of the demands, because a lot of the theorizing that has taken place, like it's essentially